Globalists have fomented war in Ukraine to establish the tyranny of the New World Order. Archbishop Carlo Maria Viganò. Monday, March 7, 2022. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Nothing is lost with peace. All can be lost with war. Let men return to understanding. Let them resume negotiating. Negotiating with goodwill and with respect for each other's rights. Let them realize that an honorable success is never precluded when there are sincere and active negotiations. And they will feel great, with true greatness, if imposing silence on the voices of passion, whether collective or private, and leaving reason to its proper domain, they will spare their brothers bloodshed and their homeland ruin. Thus it was that on August 24, 1939, Pius XII addressed both rulers and peoples as war was imminent. These were not words of empty pacifism, nor of complicit silence about the multiple violations of justice that were being carried out in many quarters. In that radio message, which some people still remember hearing, the appeal of the Roman pontiff invoked respect for each other's rights as a prerequisite for fruitful peace negotiations. The media narrative. If we look at what is happening in Ukraine, without being misled by the gross falsifications of the mainstream media, we realize that respect for each other's rights has been completely ignored. Indeed, we have the impression that the Biden administration, NATO and the European Union deliberately want to maintain a situation of obvious imbalance, precisely to make impossible any attempt at a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, provoking the Russian Federation to trigger a conflict. Herein lies the seriousness of the problem. This is the trap set for both Russia and Ukraine, using both of them to enable the globalist elite to carry out its criminal plan. It should not surprise us that pluralism and freedom of speech, so praised in countries that claim to be democratic, are daily disavowed by censorship and intolerance towards opinions not aligned with the official narrative. Manipulations of this kind have become the norm during the so-called pandemic, to the detriment of doctors, scientists and dissenting journalists, who have been discredited and ostracized for the mere fact of daring to question the effectiveness of experimental serums. 2 years later, the truth about the adverse effects and the unfortunate management of the health emergency has proven them right, but the truth is stubbornly ignored because it does not correspond to what the system wanted and still wants today. If the world media have so far been able to lie shamelessly on a matter of strict scientific relevance, spreading lies and hiding reality, we should ask ourselves why, in the present situation, they should suddenly rediscover that intellectual honesty and respect for the code of ethics widely denied with COVID. But if this colossal fraud has been supported and disseminated by the media, it must be recognized that national and international health institutions, governments, magistrates, law enforcement agencies and the Catholic hierarchy itself all share responsibility for the disaster, each in its own sphere by actively supporting or failing to oppose the narrative, a disaster that has affected billions of people in their health, their property, the exercise of their individual rights and even their very lives. Even in this case, it is difficult to imagine that those who have been guilty of such crimes in support of a pandemic that was intended and maliciously amplified could suddenly have a jolt of dignity and show solicitude for their citizens and their homeland when a war threatens their security and their economy. These, of course, can be the prudent reflections of those who want to remain neutral and look with detachment and almost disinterest at what is happening around them. But if we deepen our knowledge of the facts and document them, relying on authoritative and objective sources, we discover that doubts and perplexities soon become disturbing certainties. Even if we only want to limit our investigation to the economic aspect, we understand that news agencies, politics and public institutions themselves depend on a small number of financial groups belonging to an oligarchy that, significantly, is united not only by money and power, but by the ideological affiliation that guides its action and interference in the politics of nations and the whole world. This oligarchy shows its tentacles in the UN, NATO, the World Economic Forum, the European Union, and in philanthropic institutions such as George Soros' Open Society and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. All these entities are private and answer to no one but themselves, and at the same time they have the power to influence national governments, including through their own representatives who are made to be elected or appointed to key posts. They admit it themselves, when they are received with all the honors by heads of state and world leaders, respected and feared by these leaders as the true masters of the fate of the world. Thus, those who hold power in the name of the people find themselves trampling on the people's will and restricting their rights, in order to be obedient courtiers to masters whom nobody has elected but who nevertheless dictate their political and economic agenda to the nations. We come then to the Ukraine crisis, which is presented to us as a consequence of Vladimir Putin's expansionist arrogance towards an independent and democratic nation over which he is trying to claim absurd rights. The warmonger Putin is said to be massacring the defenseless population, who have courageously arisen to defend the soil of their homeland, the sacred borders of their nation and the violated freedoms of the citizens. The European Union and the United States, defenders of democracy, are therefore said to be unable not to intervene by means of NATO to restore Ukraine's autonomy, drive out the invader and guarantee peace. In the face of the tyrant's arrogance, it is said that the peoples of the world ought to form a common front, imposing sanctions on the Russian Federation and sending soldiers, weapons and economic aid to poor President Zylenski, national hero and defender of his people. As proof of Putin's violence, the media spread images of bombings, military searches, and destruction, attributing responsibility to Russia. And there's still more. Precisely in order to guarantee a lasting peace, the European Union and NATO are opening wide their arms to welcome Ukraine as members. And in order to prevent Soviet propaganda, Europe is now blacking out Russia Today and Sputnik, in order to ensure that information is free and independent. This is the official narrative, to which everyone conforms. Being at war, dissent immediately becomes desertion, and those who dissent are guilty of treason and deserving of more or less serious sanctions, starting with public execration and ostracism, well experienced with COVID against those who are unvaxxed. But the truth, if you want to know it, allows us to see things differently and to judge the facts for what they are and not for how they are presented to us. This is a true and proper unveiling, as indicated by the etymology of the Greek word true. Or perhaps, with an eschatological gaze, a revelation and disclosure. The expansion of NATO. First of all, it is necessary to remember the facts, which do not lie and are not susceptible to alteration. And the facts, however irritating they are to recall to those who try to censor them, tell us that since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the United States has extended its sphere of political and military influence to almost all the satellite states of the former Soviet Union, even recently, annexing into NATO Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary, 1999, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria and Romania, 2004, Albania and Croatia, 2009, Montenegro, 2017, and North Macedonia, 2020. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is preparing to expand to Ukraine, Georgia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Serbia. Practically speaking, the Russian Federation is under military threat, from weapons and missile bases, just a few kilometers from its borders, while it has no military base in similar proximity to the United States. To be considering the possible expansion of NATO into Ukraine, without thinking that it will arouse Russia's legitimate protests, is nothing short of puzzling, especially given the fact that in 1991 NATO pledged to the Kremlin not to expand further. Not only that, at the end of 2021, Der Spiegel published drafts of a treaty with the United States and an agreement with NATO on security guarantees. Moscow demanded legal guarantees from its Western partners that would prevent NATO from further eastward expansion by adding Ukraine to the alliance and also from establishing military bases in post-Soviet countries. The proposals also contained a clause on the non-deployment of offensive weapons by NATO near Russia's borders and on the withdrawal of NATO forces in Eastern Europe back to their 1997 positions. As we can see, NATO has failed to keep its commitments to Russia, or has at least forced the situation at a very delicate moment for geopolitical balances. We should ask ourselves why the United States, or rather the American deep state which regained power after the electoral fraud that brought Joe Biden to the White House, wants to create tensions with Russia and involve its European partners in the conflict, with all the consequences we can imagine. As General Marco Bertolini, former commander of the Joint Summit Operational Command, has lucidly observed, the United States did not just win the Cold War but also wanted to humiliate Russia by taking everything that in a certain sense fell within its area of influence. Putin bore with the Baltic countries, Poland, Romania and Bulgaria joining NATO. Faced with Ukraine joining NATO, which would have taken away any possibility of access to the Black Sea, he reacted. And he adds, there is a problem of the regime's stability, a situation has arisen with a fairly unlikely Prime Minister Zylenski, one who comes from the world of entertainment. The general does not fail to recall, in the case of a US attack on Russia, that the global hawks flying over Ukraine depart from Sigonella, Italy. Italy is an American military base in large part. The risk is there, it is present and real. Interests arising from the blockade of Russian gas supplies. We should also ask ourselves whether, behind the destabilization of the delicate balance between the European Union and Russia, there are also economic interests, deriving from the need of EU countries to obtain American liquid gas, for which we also need the regasification plants which many nations are deprived of, and for which in any case we will have to pay much more, instead of Russian gas, which is more ecological. The decision of Italian oil and gas company Eni to suspend investments in Gazprom's Blue Stream pipeline, from Russia to Turkey, also entails the deprivation of an additional source of supply, since it feeds the transatlantic pipeline, from Turkey to Italy. It therefore does not sound like a coincidence if, in August 2021, Zylenski declared that he considered the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany as a dangerous weapon, not only for Ukraine but for all of Europe. Bypassing Ukraine, it deprives Kyiv of about €1 billion per year in revenue from transit tariffs. We view this project exclusively through the prism of security and consider it a dangerous geopolitical weapon of the Kremlin, the Ukrainian president said, agreeing with the Biden administration. American Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland said, "If Russia invades Ukraine, Nord Stream 2 will not go forward." And so it has happened, not without serious economic damage to German investments. The Pentagon's virological laboratories in Ukraine. Still on the subject of American interests in Ukraine, it is worth mentioning the virological laboratories located in Ukraine, which are under the control of the Pentagon and where it seems that only U.S. specialists with diplomatic immunity are employed directly under the American Ministry of Defense. We should also remember the complaint made by Putin regarding the collection of genomic data about the population, which can be used for bacteriological weapons with genetic selection. Information about the activity of laboratories in Ukraine is obviously difficult to confirm, but it is understandable that the Russian Federation considered, not without reason, that these laboratories could constitute an additional bacteriological threat to the safety of the population. The U.S. Embassy has removed all files related to the Biological Threat Reduction Program from its website. Maurizio Blinde writes, Event 201, which simulated the pandemic explosion a year before it happened, was attended, along with the usuals, Bill and Melinda, by the apparently inoffensive Johns Hopkins University with its blessed Center for Health Security. The humanitarian institution had for a long time a less innocent name. It was called Center for Civilian Biodefense Strategies and did not deal with the health of Americans, but rather with its opposite, the response to military attacks of bioterrorism. It was practically a civil military organization. When it held its first conference in February 1999 in Crystal City in Arlington, Virginia, where the Pentagon is located, it brought together 950 doctors, military personnel, federal officials and health officials to participate in a simulation exercise. The aim of the simulation is to counter an imagined militarized smallpox attack. It is only the first of the exercises that will blossom in Event 201 and in the pandemic imposture. Experiments also emerge on the Ukrainian military and interventions by the American embassy regarding the Ukrainian prosecutor Lutsenko in 2016 so that he would not investigate a billionaire round of funds between G. Soros and B. Obama. An indirect threat to China's expansionist ambitions on Taiwan. The current Ukrainian crisis entails secondary, but no less serious, consequences on the geopolitical balance between China and Taiwan. Russia and Ukraine are the only producers of palladium and neon, which are indispensable for the production of microchips. Moscow's possible retaliation has attracted more attention in recent days after market research group Texit published a report highlighting the dependence of many semiconductor manufacturers on materials of Russian and Ukrainian origin such as neon, palladium and others. According to Texit's estimates, more than 90% of U.S. supplies of semiconductor neon come from Ukraine, while 35% of U.S. palladium comes from Russia. According to the U.S. International Trade Commission, neon prices rose by 600% before Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014, because chip companies relied on some Ukrainian companies. If it is true that a Chinese invasion of Formosa would put the global technology supply chain at risk, it is also true that a sudden shortage of raw materials from Russia could stop production, so as to make the island lose the microchip shield and induce Beijing to attempt the annexation of Taipei. Biden's conflict of interest in Ukraine. Another issue that we tend not to analyze in depth is that related to Burisma, an oil and gas company operating on the Ukrainian market since 2002. During the American presidency of Barack Obama, from 2009 to 2017, his right-hand man with a delegation to handle international politics was Joe Biden, and it is since then that the protection offered by the Democrat U.S. leader was given to Ukrainian nationalists, a line that created the irreconcilable disagreement between Kiev and Moscow. It was Joe Biden in those years who carried out the policy of bringing Ukraine closer to NATO. He wanted to take away political and economic power from Russia. In recent years, Joe Biden's name has also been associated with a scandal over Ukraine that had also shaken his candidacy. It was April 2014 when Burisma Holdings, the largest energy company in Ukraine, active in both gas and oil, hired Hunter Biden as a consultant with a salary of $50,000 a month. All transparent, except that during those months Joe Biden continued the American policy aimed at regaining possession by Ukraine of those areas of the Donbass that have now become republics recognized by Russia. The Donetsk area is believed to be rich in unexplored gas fields that have been targeted by Burisma Holdings. An international policy intertwined with the economic one that made the American media turn up their noses in those years. Democrats claimed that Trump had created a media scandal to harm Biden's campaign, but his accusations turned out to be true. Joe Biden himself, during a meeting at the Rockefeller Council for Foreign Relations, admitted to having intervened on then-President Petro Poroshenko and Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk to prevent investigations into his son Hunter by Procurator General Viktor Shokin. Biden had threatened to withhold a $1 billion loan guarantee in the United States during a December 2015 trip to Kiev, reports the New York Post. If the Procurator General Shokin is not fired, you will not have the money. And the prosecutor was effectively fired, saving Hunter from further scandal. Biden's interference in Kyiv politics, in exchange for favors to Burisma and corrupt oligarchs, confirms the current U.S. president's interest in protecting his family and image, fueling disorder in Ukraine and even a war. How can a person who uses his role to take care of his own interests and cover up the crimes of his family members govern honestly and without being subject to blackmail? The Ukrainian nuclear question. Finally, there is the issue of Ukrainian nuclear weapons. On February 19, 2022, at a conference in Munich, Zylenski announced his intention to end the Budapest Memorandum, 1994, which prohibits Ukraine from developing, proliferating and using atomic weapons. Among the other clauses of the memorandum, there is also the one that obliges Russia, the United States and the United Kingdom to refrain from using economic pressure on Ukraine to influence its policy, the pressure of the IMF and the United States to grant economic aid in exchange for reforms consistent with the Great Reset represent a further violation of the agreement. The Ukrainian ambassador in Berlin, Andrei Melnik, argued on Deutschlandfunk radio in 2021 that Ukraine needed to regain nuclear status if the country failed to join NATO. Ukraine's nuclear power plants are operated, rebuilt and maintained by the state-owned enterprise NEK Energoatom, which completely ended its relationship with Russian companies between 2018 and 2021. Its main partners are companies that can be traced back to the U.S. government. It is easy to understand how the Russian Federation considers the possibility of Ukraine acquiring nuclear weapons as a threat and demands Kyiv's adherence to the Non-Proliferation Pact. The Color Revolution in Ukraine and the independence of Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk. In 2013, after the government of President Viktor Yanukovych decided to suspend the association agreement between Ukraine and the European Union and to forge closer economic relations with Russia, a series of protest demonstrations known as Euromaidan began, which lasted several months and culminated in the revolution that overthrew Yanukovych and led to the installation of a new government. It was an operation sponsored by George Soros, as he candidly told CNN, "I have had a foundation in Ukraine since before it became independent of Russia. This foundation has always been in business and has played a decisive role in today's events." This change of government provoked the reaction of Yanukovych's supporters and of a part of the Ukrainian population opposed to the pro-Western shift of Ukraine, which had not been wanted by the population but was obtained by a color revolution, of which there had been general rehearsals in previous years in Georgia, Moldova, and Belarus. Following the clashes of May 2, 2014, in which nationalist paramilitary fringes, including those of Pravy sector, also intervened, there was also the massacre in Odessa. The Western press also spoke of these terrible events in a scandalized way. Amnesty International and the UN denounced these crimes and documented their brutality. But no international court initiated any proceedings against those responsible, as is intended to be done today against the alleged crimes of the Russian army. Among the many agreements not respected is also the Minsk Protocol, signed on September 5, 2014 by the Trilateral Contact Group on Ukraine, composed of representatives of Ukraine, Russia, the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic. Among the points of the agreement was also the removal of armed illegal groups, military equipment, as well as fighters and mercenaries from the territory of Ukraine under the supervision of the IS and the disarmament of all illegal groups. Contrary to what was agreed, neo-Nazi paramilitary groups are not only officially recognized by the government, but their members are even given official assignments. Also in 2014, Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk declared their independence from Ukraine, in the name of self-determination of peoples recognized by the international community, and declared themselves annexed to the Russian Federation. The Ukrainian government still refuses to recognize the independence of these regions, sanctioned by popular referendum, and leaves the neo-Nazi militias and the regular military forces themselves free to rage against the population, since it considers these entities as terrorist organizations. It is true that the two referendums of November 2, 2014 constitute a stretching of the Minsk Protocol, which provided only for a decentralization of power and a form of special status for the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. As Professor Franco Cardini recently pointed out, on February 15, 2022, Russia delivered to the United States a draft of a treaty to end this situation and defend the Russian-speaking populations. Waste paper. This war began in 2014. And it was a war in the intentions of those who wanted to fight the Russian minority of Donbass. We will have a job and pensions, and they will not. We will receive bonuses for having children, and they will not. Our children will have schools and kindergartens, their children will stay in the basements. In this way we will win this war, said President Petro Poroshenko in 2015. It will not escape notice that these measures are similar to the discrimination against the so-called unvaxxed, who have been deprived of work, pay and education. 8 years of bombing in Donetsk and Lugansk, with hundreds of thousands of victims, 150 dead children, and very serious cases of torture, rape, kidnapping and discrimination. On February 18, 2022, the presidents of Donetsk and Lugansk, Denis Pushilin and Leonid Pasechnik, ordered the evacuation of the civilian population of their provinces into the Russian Federation due to the ongoing clashes between the Donbass People's Militia and the Ukrainian armed forces. On February 21, the State Duma, lower house of the Russian parliament, unanimously ratified the treaties of friendship, cooperation and mutual assistance introduced by President Putin with the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. At the same time, the Russian president ordered the sending of troops from the Russian Federation to restore peace in the Donbass region. Here one may wonder why, in a situation of blatant violation of human rights by neo-Nazi military forces and paramilitary apparatuses, who fly flags bearing swastikas and display the effigy of Adolf Hitler, against the Russian-speaking population of the independent republics, the international community feels obliged to consider the intervention of the Russian Federation worthy of condemnation, and indeed to blame Putin for the violence. Where is the much vaunted right of the people to self-determination, which was held valid on August 24, 1991 for the proclamation of Ukraine's independence and recognized by the international community? And why are we scandalized today by a Russian intervention in Ukraine, when NATO carried out the same sort of thing in Yugoslavia, 1991, Kosovo, 1999, Afghanistan, 2001, Iraq, 2003, and in Libya and Syria, 2011, without anyone raising any objections? Not to mention that in the last 10 years Israel has repeatedly hit military targets in Syria, Iran and Lebanon to prevent the creation of a hostile armed front on its northern border, and yet no nation has proposed imposing sanctions on Tel Aviv. It is dismaying to see with what hypocrisy the European Union and the United States, Brussels and Washington, are giving their unconditional support to President Zylenski, whose government for 8 years now has continued to persecute Russian-speaking Ukrainians with impunity, for whom it is even forbidden to speak in their own language, in a nation that includes numerous ethnic groups, of which those who speak Russian represent 17.2%. And it is scandalous that they are silent about the use of civilians as human shields by the Ukrainian army, which places anti-aircraft positions inside population centers, hospitals, schools and kindergartens precisely so that their destruction can cause deaths among the population. The mainstream media is careful not to show images of Russian soldiers helping civilians reach safe positions or organizing humanitarian corridors, which Ukrainian militias fire upon. Just as it is also silent about the settling of scores, massacres, violence and theft by fringes of the civilian population, to whom Zylenski has given weapons. The videos that can be seen on the internet give an idea of the climate of civil war that has been artfully fueled by the Ukrainian government. To this we may also add the convicts released to be drafted into the army and also the volunteers of the Foreign Legion, a mass of fanatics without rules and without training that will contribute to worsening the situation, making it unmanageable. President Volodymyr Alexandrovich Zylenski. As has been pointed out by many parties, the candidacy and election of Ukrainian President Zylenski corresponds to that recent cliché, inaugurated in recent years, of a comic actor or entertainment personality being lent to politics. Do not believe that being without a suitable cursus honorum is an obstacle to the rising to the top of institutions. On the contrary, the more a person is apparently a stranger to the world of political parties, the more it is to be assumed that his success is determined by those who hold power. Zylenski's performances in drag are perfectly consistent with the LGBTQ ideology that is considered by its European sponsors as an indispensable requirement of the reform agenda that every country ought to embrace, along with gender equality, abortion and the green economy. No wonder Zylenski, a member of the WEF, was able to benefit from the support of Schwab and his allies to come to power and ensure that the Great Reset would also be carried out in Ukraine. The 57-part television series that Zylenski produced and starred in demonstrates that the media planned his candidacy for president of Ukraine and his election campaign. In the fiction show The Servant of the People, he played the part of a high school teacher who unexpectedly became president of the republic and fought against the corruption of politics. It is no coincidence that the series, which was absolutely mediocre, still won the World Fest Remy Award, USA, 2016, came among the top 4 finalists in the category of comedy films at the Seoul International Drama Awards, South Korea, and was awarded the Intermedia Globe Silver Award in the Entertainment TV Series category at the World Media Film Festival in Hamburg. The media stir obtained by Zylenski with the television series brought him over 10 million followers on Instagram and created the premise for the establishment of the homonymous Servant of the People political party, of which Ivan Bakhanov, general manager and shareholder, along with Zylenski himself and the oligarch Kolomoisky, of Kvartal 95 Studio, and the owner of the TV 1+1 television network, is also a member. Zylenski's image is an artificial product, a media fiction, an operation of manipulation of consensus that has managed to create the political character in the Ukrainian collective imagination that in reality, and not in fiction, has conquered power. Just 1 month before the 2019 elections that saw him win, Zylenski sold the company Kvartal 95 Studio to a friend, still finding a way to get the proceeds of the business he had officially renounced to his family. That friend was Serhiy Shefir, who was later appointed counselor to the presidency. The sale of the shares took place for the benefit of Maltex Multicapital Corporation, a company owned by Shefir and registered in the British Virgin Islands. The current Ukrainian president promoted his election campaign with a commercial that was disturbing, to say the least, in which, holding 2 machine guns, he fired on members of parliament, pointed out as corrupt or subservient to Russia. The fight against corruption trumpeted by the Ukrainian president in the role of servant of the people does not correspond, however, to the picture that emerges of him from the so-called Pandora Papers, in which $40 million appear to have been paid to him on the eve of the elections by the Jewish billionaire Kolomoisky through offshore accounts. Footnote. In 2011, Kolomoisky was one of the co-founders of the Jewish European Parliament, along with billionaire Vadim Rabinovich. Note that Rabinovich is a member of the opposition platform, For Life, the Ukrainian pro-Russian political party whose leader Viktor Medvedchuk was arrested by Zylenski. According to Russian politician Viktor Vladislavovich Zubarev, a member of the State Duma, Zylenski is also said to have $1.2 billion deposited at Dresdner Bank in Costa Rica and a villa in Miami purchased for $34 million. For a more comprehensive picture, see the investigation by Slidstvo Info, an independent Ukrainian agency of investigative journalism. End footnote. In his homeland, many accuse him of having taken power away from the pro-Russian oligarchs not to give it to the Ukrainian people, but rather to strengthen his own interest group and at the same time remove his political adversaries. He liquidated the ministers of the old guard, first of all the powerful Minister of the Interior, Arsen Avakov. He rudely retired the President of the Constitutional Court who was acting as a check on his laws. He closed 7 opposition TV channels. He arrested and accused of treason Viktor Medvedchuk, a pro-Russian sympathizer but above all the leader of the platform of opposition, For Life Party, the second party of the Ukrainian parliament after his Servant of the People party. He is also placing on trial for treason former President Poroshenko, who was suspicious of everyone except for those who got along with the Russians or their friends. The mayor of Kiev, the popular former world boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko, has already been subjected to several searches and seizures. In short, Zylenski seems to want to make a clean sweep of anyone who is not aligned with his politics. On April 21, 2019, Zylenski was elected president of Ukraine with 73.22% of the votes, and on May 20 he was sworn in. On May 22, 2019 he appointed Ivan Bakhanov, Director General of Kvartal 95, as first deputy head of the Security Services of Ukraine and head of the main directorate for the fight against corruption and organized crime of the Central Directorate of the Security Service of Ukraine. Along with Bakhanov, it is worth mentioning Mihailo Fedorov, Vice President and Minister of Digital Transformation, a member of the World Economic Forum. Zylenski himself has admitted to having as his inspiration the Prime Minister of Canada Justin Trudeau. Zylenski's relations with the IMF and the WEF. As Greece's tragic precedent has shown, national sovereignties and the popular will expressed by parliaments are de facto erased by the decisions of international high finance, which interferes with government policies by means of blackmail and outright extortion of an economic nature. The case of Ukraine, which is one of the poorest countries in Europe, is no exception. Shortly after Zylenski's election, the International Monetary Fund threatened not to grant Ukraine a $5 billion loan if he did not comply with their demands. During a telephone conversation with the CEO of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, the Ukrainian president was rebuked for replacing Yakov Smolyi with a man he trusted, Kirilo Shevchenko, who was less inclined to comply with the diktats of the IMF. Anders Oslin writes at Atlantic Council. The problems surrounding the Zylenski government are mounting alarmingly. First of all, since March 2020, the president has led a reversal not only of the reforms pursued under him, but also those initiated by his predecessor Petro Poroshenko. Second, His government has not presented plausible proposals to resolve IMF concerns about Ukraine's unfulfilled commitments. Third, the president appears to no longer have a ruling parliamentary majority, and he seems uninterested in forming a reformist majority. It is evident that the IMF's interventions are aimed at obtaining the Ukrainian government's commitment to align itself with the economic, fiscal and social policies dictated by the globalist agenda, beginning with the independence of the Central Bank of Ukraine from the government, a euphemism with which the IMF calls on the Kyiv government to renounce legitimate control over its central bank, which is one of the ways in which national sovereignty is exercised, along with the issuance of money and the management of public debt. On the other hand, just 4 months earlier Kristalina Georgieva had launched the Great Reset together with Klaus Schwab, Prince Charles and UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. What had not been possible with previous governments was brought to completion under the presidency of Zylenski, who entered the good graces of the WEF along with the new governor of the BCU, Kirilo Shevchenko. Less than a year later, in order to prove his subjection, Shevchenko wrote an article for the WEF entitled "Central Banks are the Key to Country's Climate Goals and Ukraine is Showing the Way." Thus the Agenda 2030 is implemented, under blackmail. There are also other Ukrainian companies that have ties to the WEF, the State Savings Bank of Ukraine, one of the largest financial institutions in Ukraine, the DTEK Group, an important private investor in the Ukrainian energy sector, and Ukrland Farming, an agricultural leader in cultivation. Banks, energy and food are sectors perfectly in line with the Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution theorized by Klaus Schwab. On February 4, 2021, the Ukrainian president shut down 7 television stations, including Zik, NewZone and 112 Ukraine, all guilty of not supporting his government. As Anna Del Frio writes, a harsh condemnation of this liberticidal act has arrived, among others, also from the European Federation of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists, who have asked for the immediate lifting of the veto. The 3 broadcasters will no longer be able to broadcast for 5 years. They employ about 1,500 people, whose jobs are now at risk. There is no real reason why the 3 networks should be shut down, except for the arbitrariness of the Ukrainian political apex, which accuses them of threatening information security and being under malign Russian influence. A strong reaction also comes from NUJU, the Ukrainian Journalists' Union, which speaks of a very heavy attack on freedom of speech, given that hundreds of journalists are being deprived of the opportunity to express themselves and hundreds of thousands of citizens are being deprived of the right to be informed. As we can see, what Putin is accused of was actually carried out by Zylenski and, more recently, by the European Union, with the complicity of social media platforms. Del Frio's article notes, shutting down television broadcasters is one of the most extreme forms of restriction of the freedom of the press, said EFJ Secretary-General Ricardo Gutierrez. Nations have an obligation to ensure effective pluralism of information. It is clear that the presidential veto is not at all in line with international standards on freedom of expression. It would be interesting to know what statements were made by the European Federation of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists after the blackout of Russia Today and Sputnik in Europe. Neo-Nazi and extremist movements in Ukraine. A country that calls for humanitarian aid from the international community to defend its population from Russian aggression should, in the collective imagination, stand out for respect for democratic principles and for legislation that prohibits activities and the spread of propaganda by extremist ideologies. Neo-Nazi movements engaged in military and paramilitary actions operate freely in Ukraine, often with the official support of public institutions. These include the following: Stepan Bandera's Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, a movement with a Nazi, anti-Semitic and racist matrix already active in Chechnya and which is part of the right sector, an association of far-right movements formed at the time of the Euromaidan coup in 2013-2014, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA, the UNA/UNSO, paramilitary wing of the far-right political party Ukraine National Assembly, the Korchinski Brotherhood, which offered protection in Kyiv to ISIS members, Misanthropic Vision, MD, a neo-Nazi network spread across 19 countries that publicly incites terrorism, extremism and hatred against Christians, Muslims, Jews, communists, homosexuals, Americans and people of color. It should be remembered that the government has given explicit support to these extremist organizations both by sending the Presidential Guard to the funerals of their representatives, as well as by supporting the Azov Battalion, a paramilitary organization that is officially part of the Ukrainian army under the new name of Azov Special Operations Regiment and organized into the National Guard. The Azov Regiment is financed by the Ukrainian Jewish oligarch Igor Kolomoisky, the former governor of Dnipropetrovsk, who is also thought to be the financier of the nationalist militias of Pravy sector, which are considered responsible for the Odessa massacre. We are talking about the same Zylenski mentioned in the Pandora Papers as a sponsor of President Zylenski. The battalion has relations with several far-right organizations in Europe and the United States. Amnesty International, after a meeting on September 8, 2014 between Secretary General Salil Shetty and Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk, called on the Ukrainian government to end the abuses and war crimes committed by the volunteer battalions that operate together with the Kiev armed forces. The Ukrainian government has opened an official investigation into the matter, declaring that no officers or soldiers of the Azov battalion appear to be under investigation. In March 2015, Ukrainian Interior Minister Arsen Avakov announced that the Azov battalion would be one of the first units to be trained by U.S. Army troops, as part of their Operation Fearless Guard training mission. U.S. training was discontinued on June 12, 2015, when the U.S. House of Representatives passed an amendment banning all aid, including weapons and training, to the battalion because of its neo-Nazi past. The amendment was then revoked under pressure from the CIA, and the soldiers of the Azov battalion were trained in the United States. We have been training these guys for 8 years now. They are really good fighters. That's where the agency's program could have a serious impact. In 2016, an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe report found that the Azov battalion was responsible for the mass killing of prisoners, the concealment of corpses in mass graves, and the systematic use of physical and psychological torture techniques. Just a few days ago, the deputy commander of the battalion, Vadim Troyan, was appointed chief of police of the Oblast region by Interior Minister Arsen Avakov. These are the heroes fighting together with the Ukrainian army against the Russian soldiers. And these heroes of the Azov battalion, instead of protecting their children, dare to make their own flesh into meat for slaughter, enlisting boys and girls, in violation of the optional protocol to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, concerning the involvement of minors in armed conflicts, an ad hoc legal instrument that establishes that no child under 18 is to be forcibly recruited or used directly in hostilities, either by the armed forces of a state nor by armed groups. Inevitably, the lethal weapons provided by the EU, including Draghi's Italy, with the support of anti-fascist political parties, are destined to be used against these children. The Ukrainian war and the plans of the NWO. The censorship being imposed against Russian broadcasters is clearly aimed at preventing the official narrative from being disproven by the facts. But while the Western media shows images of the video game War Thunder, frames from the movie Star Wars, explosions in China, videos of military parades, footage from Afghanistan, the Rome metro, or images of mobile crematoria by passing them off as real and recent scenes of the war in Ukraine, reality is ignored because it has already been decided to provoke a conflict as a weapon of mass distraction that legitimizes new restrictions of freedoms in Western nations, according to the plans of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and the United Nations Agenda 2030. It is evident that the Ukrainian people, beyond the issues that diplomacy can resolve, are victims of the same global coup d'état being carried out by supranational powers that intend, not peace between nations, but rather the establishment of the tyranny of the New World Order. Just a few days ago, Ukrainian parliamentarian Kira Rudik told Fox News, while holding a Kalashnikov, "We know that we are not only fighting for Ukraine, but also for the New World Order." The human rights violations in Ukraine and the crimes of the neo-Nazi militias repeatedly denounced by Putin could not find a political solution because they were planned and fomented by the globalist elite, with the collaboration of the European Union, NATO and the American deep state, with an anti-Russian tone intended to make inevitable a war whose goal is to impose, primarily in Europe, the forced adoption of energy rationing, travel restrictions, the replacement of paper money with electronic money, and the adoption of digital ID. Footnote. Regarding energy rationing, it should be noted that the Italian Minister of Ecological Transition, Roberto Cingolani, decided a few days ago to sell a share of oil stocks to Ukraine as a concrete aid also on the energy front, exactly as during the pandemic he gave away millions of masks to China, only to then buy them back from Beijing shortly thereafter. End footnote. We are not talking about theoretical projects. These are decisions that are about to be taken concretely at the European level as well as in individual countries. Respect for the law and standards. The intervention in Ukraine by NATO, the United States, and the European Union does not appear to have any legitimacy. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and as such it should not benefit from the assistance of an entity whose purpose is the defense of its member nations. The same can be said of the European Union, which just a few days ago invited Zylenski to join it. In the meantime, Ukraine has received $2.5 billion from the United States since 2014 and another $400 million in 2021 alone, plus other funds for a total of $4.6 billion. For his part, Putin has given $15 billion in loans to Ukraine to save it from bankruptcy. The European Union, for its part, has sent $17 million in funding, in addition to funding sent from various individual nations. But this assistance has benefited the Ukrainian population only minimally. Furthermore, by intervening in the war in Ukraine in the name of the European Union, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is violating Articles 9, 11, and 12 of the Treaty of Lisbon. The competence of the European Union in this area belongs to the European Council and the High Representative. In no case does it belong to the Commission President. In what capacity does President von der Leyen presume to act as if she were the head of the European Union, usurping a role that does not belong to her? Why does no one intervene, especially considering the danger to which European citizens are being exposed due to the possibility of Russian retaliation? Furthermore, in many cases the constitutions of the nations that are today sending support and weapons to Ukraine do not provide for the possibility of entering into a conflict. For example, Article 11 of the Italian Constitution states, Italy repudiates war as an instrument of offense for the liberty of other peoples and as a means of resolving international controversies. Sending weapons and soldiers to a nation that is not a part of either NATO or the European Union constitutes a de facto declaration of war on the nation belligerent with it, in this case, Russia, and should therefore require the prior deliberation of declaring war, as is foreseen by Article 78 of the Italian Constitution. The chambers of Parliament deliberate on the state of war and confer the necessary powers on the government. It does not appear that to date the chambers have been called upon to express themselves in this sense, or that the President of the Republic has intervened to demand compliance with the constitutional provision. Prime Minister Draghi, appointed by the globalist cabal for the destruction of Italy and its definitive enslavement to supranational powers, is one of the many heads of national governments who considers the will of the citizens as an annoying obstacle to the execution of the agenda of the World Economic Forum. After 2 years of systematic violations of fundamental rights and of the Constitution, it is difficult to believe that he will want to place the interests of the Italian nation ahead of the interests of those who have placed him in power. On the contrary, the more disastrous are the effects of the sanctions adopted by his government, the more he can consider himself appreciated by those who have given him power. The coup perpetrated by means of the psychopandemic emergency proceeds today with new unfortunate decisions, ratified by a parliament without a spine. It is also a violation of Article 288 of the Italian Penal Code to permit Italian citizens, and even members of the majority in the government and political leaders, to respond to the appeal of the Ukrainian ambassador for enrollment in the Foreign Legion. Anyone in the territory of Italy who without government approval enlists or arms citizens to serve in the military in favor of a foreign nation, is to be punished with imprisonment for a period of 4 to 15 years. No magistrate, at least for the time being, has intervened to punish those responsible for this crime. Another violation is found in the activity of transferring children from Ukraine to Italy, and presumably also to other nations, who have been obtained via surrogate motherhood, ordered by Italian couples in violation of Law 40/2004, without any penalty being imposed on those guilty of this crime, as well as their accomplices. It should also be remembered that the utterances of members of the government or of political leaders with regard to the Russian Federation and its president, along with the sanctions that have been adopted against Russia and the repeated instances of arbitrary discrimination against Russian citizens, companies, artists, and sports teams for the sole fact of being Russian, are not only provocations that ought to be avoided in order to allow for a serene and peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis, but also place the safety of Italian citizens in very serious danger, as well as the safety of citizens of other nations who are adopting a similar stance toward Russia. The reason for such rash temerity is incomprehensible, unless there is an intentional desire to trigger reactions from the opposing party. The Russian-Ukrainian conflict is a very dangerous trap that has been set against Ukraine, Russia, and the nations of Europe. Ukraine is the latest victim of accomplished executioners. The Russian-Ukrainian crisis did not suddenly erupt a month ago. It has been prepared and fomented for a long time, certainly beginning with the 2014 white coup that was desired by the American deep state in an anti-Russian key. This is demonstrated, among other incontestable facts, by the training of the Azov battalion by the CIA to kill Russians, with the CIA forcing the revocation of the amendment banning aid to the battalion made by Congress in 2015. The interventions made by Joe and Hunter Biden have gone in the same direction. Thus there is evidence of long-term premeditation, consistent with NATO's relentless expansion towards the east. The color revolution of Euromaidan, as well as the establishment of a pro-NATO government composed of Hamans Novi trained by the World Economic Forum and George Soros, was intended to create the conditions for the subordination of Ukraine to the NATO bloc, removing it from the influence of the Russian Federation. To this end, the subversive action of the Hungarian philanthropists NGOs, supported by media propaganda, has kept silent about the crimes of neo-Nazi paramilitary organizations, financed by the same people who sponsor Zylenski. But if the brainwashing carried out by the mainstream media in Western nations has succeeded in conveying a completely distorted narrative of reality, the same cannot be said for Ukraine, where the population is well aware of the corruption of the political class in power as well as of its remoteness from the real problems of the Ukrainian nation. We in the West believe that the oligarchs are only in Russia, while the reality is that they are present above all throughout the entire galaxy of nations that formerly composed the Soviet Union, where they can accumulate wealth and power simply by placing themselves at the disposition of foreign philanthropists and multinational corporations. It matters little if their offshore accounts are the primary cause of the poverty of the citizens of these nations, the backwardness of the healthcare system, the excessive power of the bureaucracy, the almost total absence of public services, foreign control of strategic companies, and the progressive loss of sovereignty and national identity. The important thing is to make money and be immortalized along with political personalities, bankers, arms dealers, and those who starve the people. And then to come to the fashionable resorts of Versilia or the Amalfi Coast to flaunt their yachts and platinum cards to the waiter from Odessa or the cleaning lady from Kyiv who send their paltry wages to their relatives back home. These Ukrainian billionaires wearing kippas are those who are selling out Ukraine to the corrupted and corrupting West, trading their own well-being for the enslavement of their compatriots to the usurers who are taking over the world, using the same ruthless and immoral systems everywhere. In the past they cut the salaries of workers in Athens and Thessaloniki. Today they have simply enlarged their horizons to the whole of Europe, where the population still looks on incredulously while first a health dictatorship and then an environmental dictatorship is being imposed. On the other hand, without the pretext of a war, how would they have been able to justify the soaring price of gas and fuels, forcing the process of an ecological transition imposed from on high in order to control the impoverished masses? How could they have made the peoples of the Western world swallow the establishment of the tyranny of the New World Order, when the pandemic farce was unraveling and bringing to light crimes against humanity committed by Big Pharma? And while the EU and heads of government blame Russia for the impending disaster, the Western elites demonstrate that they even want to destroy agriculture, in order to apply the horrors of the Holodomor on a global scale. On the other hand, in many nations, including Italy, the privatization of waterways is being theorized, and water is an inalienable public good, for the advantage of multinationals and with the aim of controlling and limiting agriculture activities. The pro-NATO government of Kyiv did not behave much differently. For 8 years the Crimea was deprived of water from the Dnieper River in order to prevent the irrigation of the fields and starve the people. Today, in light of the sanctions being imposed on Russia and the huge reduction of grain supplies, we can understand Bill Gates' enormous investments in agriculture, following the same ruthless profit-making logic already experienced with the vaccine campaign. The Ukrainian people, regardless of what ethnic group they may belong to, are merely the latest unwitting hostages of the supranational totalitarian regime that brought the national economies of the entire world to their knees through the COVID deception, after publicly theorizing about the need to decimate the world population and transform the survivors into chronically ill patients who have irreparably compromised their immune systems. The Ukrainian people should think hard about calling upon the intervention of NATO or the EU, provided that it is really the Ukrainian people who do it and not rather their corrupt rulers aided by racist mercenaries and neo-Nazi groups in the pay of hierarchs. Because while they are promised freedom from the invader, with whom they share the common religious and cultural heritage of having once been part of Great Russia, in reality what is cynically being prepared is their definitive cancellation, their enslavement to the Great Reset that foresees everything except the protection of their identity, their sovereignty, and their borders. Let the Ukrainian people look at what has happened to the nations of the European Union. The mirage of prosperity and security is demolished by the contemplation of the rubble left by the euro and the lobbies of Brussels. Nations invaded by illegal immigrants who feed crime and prostitution, destroyed in their social fabric by politically correct ideologies, knowingly brought to bankruptcy by reckless economic and fiscal policies, led towards poverty by the cancellation of labor and social security protections, deprived of a future by the destruction of the family and the moral and intellectual corruption of the new generations. What were once prosperous and independent nations, diverse in their respective ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and religious specificities, have now been transformed into a shapeless mass of people without ideals, without hopes, without faith, without even the strength to react against the abuses and crimes of those who govern them. A mass of corporate customers, slaves of the system of detailed control imposed by the pandemic farce, even in the face of evidence of the fraud. A mass of persons without individual identity, marked with QR codes like animals on an intensive farm, like products of a huge shopping center. If this has been the result of the renunciation of national sovereignty for all the nations, every single one, without exception, that have entrusted themselves to the colossal scam of the European Union, why would Ukraine be any different? Is this what your fathers wanted, what they hoped for, what they desired, when they received baptism along with Vladimir the Great on the banks of the Dnieper. If there is a positive aspect that each of us can recognize in this crisis, it is that it has revealed the horror of the globalist tyranny, its ruthless cynicism, its capacity to destroy and annihilate everything it touches. It is not the Ukrainians who ought to enter the European Union or NATO, it is rather the other nations who ought to finally be jolted by pride and courage to leave them, shaking off this detestable yoke and rediscovering their own independence, sovereignty, identity, and faith. Their own souls. To be clear, the new order is not an inescapable destiny, and it can be subverted and denounced, if only the peoples of the world realize that they have been deceived and swindled by an oligarchy of clearly identifiable criminals, who one day will have to answer for those sanctions and those blocks of funds that today they apply with impunity to anyone who does not bend the knee before them. An appeal to the Third Rome. For Russia too, this conflict is a trap. This is because it would fulfill the dream of the American deep state to definitively oust Russia from the European context in its commercial and cultural relations, pushing it into the arms of China, perhaps with the hope that the dictatorship in Beijing can persuade the Russians to accept the system of social credit and other aspects of the Great Reset that thus far Russia has been able to avoid, at least in part. It is a trap, not because Russia is wrong in wanting to denazify Ukraine of its extremist groups and guarantee protection to Russian-speaking Ukrainians, but because it is precisely these reasons, theoretically tenable, that were created specifically to provoke it and induce it to invade Ukraine, in such a way as to provoke the NATO reaction that has been prepared for some time by the deep state and the globalist elite. The casus belli was deliberately planned by the real perpetrators of the conflict, knowing that it would obtain exactly that response from Putin. And it is up to Putin, regardless of whether he is right, not to fall into the trap, and to instead turn the tables, offering Ukraine the conditions of an honorable peace without continuing the conflict. Indeed, the more Putin believes he is right, the more he needs to demonstrate the greatness of his nation and his love for his people by not giving in to provocations. Permit me to repeat the words of the prophet Isaiah: "Loose the bands of wickedness, undo the bundles that oppress, let those who are broken go free, and break asunder every burden. Share your bread with the hungry, welcome into your house the afflicted and homeless. When you see a naked man, clothe him, and do not turn your back on your own flesh. Then your light will arise like the dawn, and your wound will quickly be healed. Your justice shall go before you, the glory of the Lord will closely follow you." Is 58-6-8. The world crisis with which the dissolution of traditional society is being prepared has also involved the Catholic Church, whose hierarchy is held hostage by apostates who are courtiers of power. Footnote. In its March 6 issue, Familia Cristiana has a headline, commenting on an article by the founder of the San Egidio community, Andrea Riccardi, "Let's stop the war and build a new world order." End footnote. There was a time in which popes and prelates confronted kings without concern for human respect, because they knew they spoke with the voice of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings. The Rome of the Caesars and popes is now deserted and silent, just as for centuries the Second Rome of Constantinople has also been silent. Perhaps Providence has ordained that Moscow, the Third Rome, will today in the sight of the world take on the role of Kachon, 2 Thess 2-6-7, of eschatological obstacle to the Antichrist. If the errors of communism were spread by the Soviet Union, even to the point of imposing themselves within the Church, Russia and Ukraine can today have an epochal role in the restoration of Christian civilization, contributing to bringing the world a period of peace from which the Church too will rise again purified and renewed in her ministers. The United States of America and the European nations should not marginalize Russia, but rather form an alliance with her, not only for the restoration of trade for the prosperity of all, but in view of the reconstruction of a Christian civilization, which alone can save the world from the globalist techno-health transhuman monster. Final considerations. There is great concern that the destinies of the peoples of the world is in the hands of an elite that is not accountable to anyone for its decisions, that does not recognize any authority above itself, and that in order to pursue its own interests does not hesitate to jeopardize security, the economy, and the very lives of billions of people, with the complicity of politicians in their service and the mainstream media. The falsification of facts, the grotesque adulterations of reality, and the partisanship with which the news is spread stand alongside the censorship of dissenting voices and leads to forms of ethnic persecution against Russian citizens, who are discriminated against precisely in the countries that say they are democratic and respectful of fundamental rights. I earnestly hope that my appeal for the establishment of an anti-globalist alliance that unites the peoples of the world in opposition against the tyranny of the New World Order will be accepted by those who have at heart the common good, peace between nations, concord among all peoples, freedom for all citizens and the future of the new generations. And even before that, may my words, along with those of many intellectually honest people, contribute to bringing to light the complicity and corruption of those who use lies and fraud to justify their crimes, even in these moments of great apprehension about the war in Ukraine. May the strong listen to us, so as not to become weak in injustice. May the powerful listen to us, if they want their power not to be destruction but support for the peoples and protection for tranquility and order and work. Pius XII, radio message to heads of state and peoples of the world in imminent danger of war, August 24, 1939. May Holy Lent lead all Christians to ask pardon from the Divine Majesty for the sins of those who trample His holy law. May penance and fasting move the Lord God to mercy, while we repeat the words of the prophet Joel, Pars, Domini, Pars populo tuo, et ne de hereditatem tuum in opprobrium, ut dominantur eis nations. Forgive your people, Lord, and do not expose your inheritance to reproach, to the derision of the nations, JL 2:17. Carlo Maria Viganò, Archbishop, former Apostolic Nuncio to the United States of America, March 6, 2022, First Sunday of Lent.